Welcome to the Coachful Coaching Leadership Podcast. I'm David Fung, an executive leadership coach and seasoned people leader. This podcast is all about helping leaders grow, navigate challenges, and build high-performing teams with real stories, insights, and strategies you can apply today. Let's dive in.
If you had to go back to the 20-year-old Urs and tell him three things, and you only had 30 seconds, what would you say to him?
Go abroad earlier. Immerse yourself in different cultures earlier. Be in your 20s less apologetic about following your passions, what you really want to do versus what you think others, including your family, is expecting from you. And then don't get married the first time round. That's right. Oh, you love that.
There's so many things I want to ask you. And welcome back, everyone, to the Coachful Coaching Leadership Podcast. I'm actually very excited today to talk to my friend Urs Koenig. Did I say that right, Urs?
Perfect.
Okay, Urs Koenig. I'm going to say that only twice. And now I'm going to hand it over to you, Urs. First of all, origin of your name, Urs, and then just a little bit about you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, David. I'm really excited to be here. So yeah, my name is a very unusual name in English-speaking countries. The root is actually Ursus, which is the bear, right? So my parents called me the bear, and my last name is Koenig, which means king. So I'm actually the bear king. I had nothing to do with that. It's all my parents, right? So
yeah, blame it on our parents.
Exactly. It's all their fault. Always is, right? So yeah, it's Latin Ursus, and in French is Urs, O-U-R-S. Very common Swiss name, absolutely hopeless in English-speaking countries. Exactly. Yeah.
So we got connected, and you sent me a copy of that book that's right above your right shoulder there, right? Radical Humility. So for those who are just listening, Urs recently published a book called Radical Humility. I want to get to that in a second because I find your background, what you've done in the past, very, very fascinating. And I'm guessing it's informed what you write in the book, Radical Humility. You used to be in the NATO military, right, in the past, and you have some pretty interesting background. You talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I'm Swiss, and as Swiss nationals, we all have to do mandatory military service. So I did that in my 20s, but then I moved abroad. I moved to Australia for 7 years, and I've been in the States now for 24 years. So when you move abroad as a Swiss, they de-enlist you from the armed forces. But I went back. At age 49, I actually, after having been out of the service for 22 years and rejoined the Swiss military to serve as a peacekeeper for NATO in the Balkans for 9 months in 2017, 2018. And then I was in the Middle East for the UN as a UN Blue Helmet peacekeeper in 21 in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Egypt. So that was for a year. So yeah, I've been an executive coach for a long time before that. Before that, actually, I was an academic. My PhD is in geography of all things. People are always surprised. I did research into climate change way back before anybody talked about that. And then I have been in leadership development for a very long time. And then, if it's okay, I share a personal story why I actually rejoined the military. I was approaching 50. My dad, who was a very important person in my life, passed away recently. And I had a good hard look at my life. And I asked myself, what are the things I still want to experience and do? And doing meaningful international mission work, not religious mission work, but mission work, was one of those things. I actually originally studied geography because I wanted to get into that line of work, was what was back then called overseas aid. So anyway, I really had a good hard look at my life and said, this is what I still want to do. And then I did a bunch of research. I applied to NGOs, government organizations as well, and then found peacekeeping and, ticked a lot of boxes. So I went back in, and that was, talking about humility, that was humbling. After having been out for 22 years, to go back in as a sort of mid-level officer, as a captain with a command, but with, bosses and peers. But I loved it on many levels. One of the things I love about it is, as a coach, as an executive coach, to go back into my client's shoes, right? Have teams, have peers in a matrix, have direct reports. So I love leadership. I love coaching it. I love talking about it. I love writing about it, and I love doing it. So the peacekeeping really, I'm a solopreneur here. I don't have an empire by design. gave me opportunity to live and experience some of those leadership principles I feel so passionate about. That was a very long answer, David. I own it.
You owned it. Well, I think this is a fascinating story because, and I'd love for you to weave in some stories of like what you actually did there overseas. But in your book, Radical Humility, you talk a lot about, a shift from heroic leadership to humble leadership. And what was your aha moment to say, we got to make this shift?
I'm not sure I have one aha moment, but definitely, surprisingly, my experience in the peacekeeping force in the military actually was a formative experience. People always think of the military as only top-down command control, like heroic, like I define it. The leader has to have all the answers, sits on top, knows everything best. But the best commanders I had in these peacekeeping forces were deeply humble. They deployed a growth mindset. They built meaningful relationships with their teammates. They, we'll talk about those shifts later on, but they were tough on results. People, they owned their stuff. I will never forget, during one of that second mission in the Middle East, my commanding officer opened an after-action review with these words. She said, "I screwed that up, and I know it. And here is what we're going to do so it won't happen ever again." So her ability to go first, own their best ups, then made it safe for all of us, her direct reports, to do the same. And so this particular after-action review actually resulted in way better operations on the ground, all because she went first. And to be clear, there were plenty of non-humble commanders as well, to be totally clear. But the most effective ones I've experienced and had the pleasure to work with were deeply humble. So the experience of going back in the military actually really opened my eyes. Because before that, look, I read all the books. I'm not a practitioner per se, right? I'm a consultant, I'm a speaker, I'm an executive coach. But then to actually see it and live it in action, that was very powerful.
Yeah. You talk a lot about failing successfully. What's that mean to you, failing successfully?
So failing successfully means it means primarily I learn from my failures. I own it and I learn from it. And I don't get flooded, or I move past the point of being flooded by strong emotions of shame, embarrassment. To be clear, all of us, we're all high achievers. When, I'm including, or I'm sure most of your listeners, all of your listeners are high achievers. Let's be real. When we fail, when we make mistakes, especially when we make it publicly, we often get flooded with these strong emotions, shame, embarrassment versus guilt. And so that then makes us hide or sort of ignore those failures or, or sweep them under the carpet. So failing successfully means learning. I failed so many times in my life, in my career. I got laid off because I didn't know I was fired actually because I didn't know when to keep my mouth shut, for example. So that was, look.
Sounds like there's a story behind there.
Well, I'll tell you the story. So now it's a funny story. So I told you I've been an executive coach for a long time. A client hired me and made me an offer and I couldn't refuse. So I went in-house for an investment advising firm. The same firm I'm still a client with, by the way, to this day. And this was during the financial crisis or just before the financial crisis. I got hired. Then the financial crisis hit. Revenue tanked because we're paid for percentage of assets under management. Cost cutting. We went through 2-3 rounds of layoffs, and the 3 C-level executives brought me in the room. I was the director of marketing and asked me for my views on what else we can cut. And so we went through every line item on P&L, and then I knew nothing better to say that, well, for a firm of our size, we shouldn't really have 3 C-level executives. I think 1 would be enough. It did not prove to be a career-enhancing move.
No matter how truthful it was.
Exactly. And so because I'm so humble, right, in time, so then I was let go. And the bigger lesson that this comes back to failing successfully. So I was let go. I was not happy. My pride was hurt. I actually really liked the job despite the difficult environment. And nobody, frankly, likes to be laid off or fired for whatever reason. Let's be real. But it taught me this very simple lesson. As a coach, sometimes my strength is to speak what nobody else is willing or able to say, right? Sort of the elephant in the room. So that's often the value we bring in as external consultants. But sometimes I have to learn to shut up. And that was not always my strength. So that was a big one for me, really not being more thoughtful around how to say it and when to say it. So that's a failing successfully.
I guess, how do you teach people that? And I'm sure you've come across this, like, on one hand, we want to ensure that we're speaking up and speaking truth, right? On the other hand, it's accepting those consequences if we do so, right? How do you balance the two? Like, humility doesn't mean you don't speak truth, right? Humility can
Absolutely
mean,
not.
yeah. So, like, how do you help people, like, who are listening out there understand, like, hey, you're humble, you speak truth, but there's consequences to this.
Yeah. I think the first thing, and that's as much to me as to anybody listening, for whose benefit are you saying what you're saying? Are you because you want to sound smart? Because you want to show off? Like, for whose benefit are you saying what you're saying? And there's obviously also a difference between speaking truth to power and being disrespectful, right? And so this is why leadership is a thinking person sport, right? We got to read the room. I did not read the room well. It was true. 2 years later, they had one C-level executive, but it didn't serve. The timing was totally off. It didn't serve the issue at the time. But, I talk about the fearless culture, psychological safe culture, and that is about speaking truth to power. So for us as leaders, and I don't want to now make it sound like in this incident where I was laid off, that it was, all their fault, right? But as leaders, I want to make it safe for my team members to speak up. So concrete things we have to do are literally things like, hey, I need to hear from everybody. David, I haven't heard from you. What are your thoughts? Like, explicitly inviting our team members to speak up is an important piece in here.
Yeah. Yeah. If more people learn how to do that'd be a great world.
It would be, indeed. Yeah. And by the way, also, if I may follow up from that, so one thing is then encouraging speaking up. I have a whole little framework in the book around championing a fearless culture. But then importantly, it's acknowledging and thanking. So if you say, I want everybody's input, and then you have dismissive body language or you cut people off, like, that's no good. I often say we always ask as leaders, we always listen, we always thank, but then we make the decision on what we're going to change or not. I see you smirk. You're smirking for a reason.
Oh, no, because there's this one leader in a previous job where they're around the proverbial boardroom table, and they're like, super aggressive. Okay, I need you to speak up. Come on, give me feedback. And so their subordinates, out of fear, in my opinion, started giving feedback. I think this project could go wrong here, and it's probably not at the best time, blah, blah, blah. And this person was just shooting each person down. Like, I want your feedback. Boom, boom. Everyone was getting sniped, right? And I pulled the person aside later. I go, hey, so how do you think that went? Like, yeah, people need to speak up more. Okay. Did you notice how you reacted every time one of your subordinates spoke up? I'm like, well, I'm just critiquing it, being honest. No, you're actually discouraging people from speaking up because they're going to get attacked every time they voice their opinion and voice it honestly, right? And you have to understand where your position is. Like, when you're loud, people will shut up, right? People will shut up. And so I think that's why I'm smirking, where people say, I want you to speak up. You speak up. It's like, well, that's a load of shit, right? Pardon my French. So have you seen that? Yeah.
Absolutely. Like, and not a million times, fortunately, but a lot. So, and that's exactly right. So I think and let's be real, like, even if we're not as extreme as the leader you're describing, or I'm sure many of your listeners have also experienced extreme situations like that. But let's be real, even if we're reasonably self-aware, like we actually know that, we listen to what people have to say, it's hard for us to thank for an input that we totally disagree with, right? But that's actually what we need to do. No matter how much I agree or disagree, my first reaction as leaders after I invite feedback is always to say thank you and actually mean it. Yeah. And then we can always debate it, right? Absolutely. Yeah. But this is why all this stuff is so simple, but it's not easy. Psychological safety takes weeks, months, sometimes years to build, and it can vanish in a second if you as a leader have disrespectful body language or you're smirking or whatever.
Yep. The smirk I was just doing while someone's explaining something. This is a podcast, just me and you. It's okay.
Exactly.
Oh man, I have so many stories to share here. But
can I say something about that, David?
Sure.
Sorry. Look, I have a whole section as you mentioned around a fearless culture. It's something that's really hard to build. It's easy to write about this and talk about it. It's very hard to build. And I've experienced that myself. And what I would encourage folks to do is, even if you're in a hierarchical culture, even if you're in a fear-based culture, potentially, if you have a team, train yourself to look down into your team versus sideways and up and throw your hands up and say, oh, this is terrible here, I can't do anything. Like, look down. And this actually, Amy Edmondson coined that one. Train yourself to look down, and you have way more control within your team than you actually think, and you can build a pocket of a fearless excellence in your team.
Yeah. I guess that's a shameless plug that you put in there on LinkedIn as well. Amy Edmondson with your book.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Congratulations, by the way.
Well, thank you. No, look,
I see your book on your bookshelf, The Right Kind of Wrong. So.
Exactly. I think very highly of her, and I'm honored and humbled that she endorsed my work. Yeah.
Now, that's a huge accomplishment there. So congratulations. And
Thank you.
I've read most of her book. I can't remember most of it, but The Right Kind of Wrong, where she was analyzing the different types of mistakes,
different
the avoidable mistakes. Yeah, the different types of failures, the catastrophic ones, right? So pretty interesting. So I guess just for yourself, right? What's the impact you're looking to have? You released this book, it's been successful, you're being endorsed by someone like Amy Edmondson, who's well known in these circles. What do you hope to impact around you?
So, in the green room, we just talked about the bigger world out there. So I'm always a totally open book. So I'm torn right now, actually. The sort of off the shelf answer, which is the truthful answer, is that I actually truly believe that humble leadership makes for better leaders, can make for a better world. So I actually believe that when we have more leaders embrace a more radically humble leadership approach, that can make a difference in their teams, that can make a difference then in their teams' families and communities. And so it can spread like that. And so I do this through writing, through podcasts like these, through speaking primarily actually off the platform. And so that's the impact that I hope that my work can have in actually making the world a slightly better place. And so I know that's sort of a grandiose idea, but I am, going back to my peacekeeping work as well, really drawn to making a difference. So that's part of it. On the other hand, I am looking at another mission. I actually am looking at potentially going back into the field. So I am looking at potentially volunteering in the Ukraine, actually doing some stuff there. So so very hands-on, very practical, on the ground, making a difference. So I'm sort of torn between these two worlds right now of the, what we call loosely the thought leadership work, and then the very practical mission work out in the field. And I haven't quite figured it out. It's a personal decision, of course, because I have one more year with my high school here in Seattle, so I can't just bugger off again, so that would not be fair to him. So it's a bit of a pull, I feel.
Yeah. What do you want to do in Ukraine?
I would, volunteer in some sort of shape or form, support the civilian authorities so they can then support the war effort better. So something like that. I wouldn't go for the front lines. I mean, that's out of the question.
Yeah. There is a time and place for a lot of that.
Yes,
in
exactly.
everyone's career, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Fearless. You mentioned something about fearless teams and safety speaking up, right? I guess, what did you learn in the military about teams and fearless teams? You mentioned that example of a superior, volunteering. Hey, I messed up, right? But I guess, here's where my curiosity is how do you get more team cultures like that? I know the theory behind it, you should act a certain way, but where I struggle is, how do we multiply that effect? How do we get more leaders and subordinates who want to do that, who want to actually volunteer? Hey, this is where I messed up. Here's where I can do better. How do we do that?
So one thing we can do is inspire them with good examples, and I'll give a few examples, and then it's training and teaching and coaching. And so going back to the military, the best and most successful teams, especially in the military, are actually deeply vulnerable together. If you look at special ops teams, they constantly tell each other how much they love each other. Mm-hmm. The special operations teams, if you are lucky enough, if that's your thing anyway, and you get trained there, it's like humility first, rank never. Like everybody speaks up because everybody's lives is in each other's hands, right? And so there's the power of vulnerability. So vulnerability is one of the quickest ways to build trust, actually. And so inspiring folks with, for example, special ops teams that are deeply humble, deeply vulnerable, own their stuff, and are highly successful. Some of the best teams ever. So that's the inspiration. The second piece then is, how do we get people to do this? Let's have some courage. Let's have some guts, because you know what? The soft stuff is not soft. The soft stuff is tough, right?
Tough. Yeah.
It's tough. It's tough to stand up and say, I screwed that up. It's tough to say, hey, I want to, take our team culture to the next level. Here's how this looks. We need to talk about failure. By the way, when's the last time that we had a conversation in our teams about how we deal with failures? What's our failure culture? And then, you talked about Amy Edmondson's work. Is it an intelligent failure? That's a different response than if it's a complex or a basic failure. So talking about how we deal with failures in our teams, what failures are, desirable and what are not acceptable, and we need to speak up about them all. And so the reframing failure conversation needs to happen. And then we talked about encouraging speaking up and acknowledging and thanking. And one of the most powerful ways, actually, to build a more humble, vulnerable, strong team culture is to actually take your team out of the office and do some experiential learning together. And, I'm not talking about the circles we fell backwards, the trustfuls, that's right. But like simple things.
I haven't dropped anyone yet, so.
But literally take your team and do a cooking class. It sounds silly, but that's how you
it's camaraderie right there.
Camaraderie. Yeah. You get to know people on a different level. And when you get to know people on a different and more personal level, at the core of humble leadership is actually leading relationally, getting to know my people. I understand what David really wants. Hubert Joly, when he turned Best Buy around, the manager, the famous story you probably heard, the manager in the Boston store had everybody's dreams, life dreams displayed in the back room. And the manager of the store said to Hubert Joly, my job is to help them achieve their dream, whatever that might be, right? Send my kid to college, buy that new house, whatever it might be. So getting to know my team members on a meaningful, deep level deeper and more meaningful level, that's an important first step as well.
That is, I find that very touching. It reminds me of a story. I went out with some team members a few weeks ago, and some of them were new to my team, like they just came over from another team. And it's interesting when everyone's, it's almost 9:00 at night, everyone's hungry, everyone's had some drinks, and we went to this pizza restaurant, and like, okay, there's 15 of us. What should we get? Here's what happened. 2 people stepped up. One person started going around with their phone. He's like, Urs, what do you want to drink? I'm like, sorry, do you work here now? It's like, no, I'm effing hungry, and I'm going to get everyone's drinks now. I'm going to the bar, and I'm going to get all your drinks right now. And we just started laughing. We're like, oh, wow, watch out for that one, right? Like, she's a firecracker, but also like just taking charge. I loved it. And then the other guy, usually a funny guy and everything, he started going, okay, guys, this is what we're ordering. All right, you good? You good? No vegetarians? All right. And he just went up there and he ordered everything for us, right? It was amazing to see that. And yeah. I think everyone appreciated it because you know how it is in a group. Maybe I'll have this chicken. Maybe he's like, okay, I'm going to order these 5 things. Good? Anyone object? No? Okay, let's go.
That's such a great story, David, because it's such a simple. All you did is you went out for drinks and then you went to a pizza restaurant and people got to know each other on a different level than if they would have just had a meeting at the office or whatever. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. I love that story. That's excellent. Yeah.
It was so fun. It was so fun with that crew. Well, like, Urs, I have a few more questions for you. One of them I'd like to ask everyone is, so you've had many, long travels in your life. You've seen a lot of things. If you had to go back to the 20-year-old Urs and tell them 3 things.
Three.
And you only had 30 seconds. What would you say to him?
Go abroad earlier. Immerse yourself in different cultures earlier. Be in your piece less apologetic about following your passions, what you really want to do versus what you think others, including your family, is expecting from you. And then don't get married the first time round. Oh, that's right. I love that. It's the coaching podcast. There you go. Very personal. But yeah, that's it.
There's so many things I want to ask you, but I shouldn't do this while we're recording. Okay. I guess for leaders out there, if you have to leave like a couple pieces of advice for everyone who are listening to this podcast in 1 minute, what would the advice be?
Start asking for regular feedback on your leadership in your one-on-one meetings. Hopefully you have your one-on-ones every week or every other week. At the end, get into the habit of saying, hey, David, give me some feedback. How am I doing as a manager? What can I do better? What I do well? What can I do better? And I only have a minute. You want to frame that before in an all-hands meeting where you tell them you're going to ask that so they're not blindsided. And then there's some tools I can share later on how to actually make people open up. So asking for feedback from your team members on a regular basis so it doesn't become this one-off thing we do once a year or every 6 months. Mm-hmm. Number 1. Number 2, we already touched on this, is get to know your team members on a meaningful personal level. And by the way, that is different for every single one of your teammates. Some team members want to talk about deep stuff immediately. And with others, all you do is talk about the weekend. And that's totally fine. That's totally fine. But get to know them on a meaningful, more or deeper level than you normally otherwise would. And you watch what happens to your team culture. Those 2 things.
Okay. Last question. I always ask everyone this one. What's one question I didn't ask you, but I should have asked you?
You didn't ask me, Urs, you talk about this radical humility approach. And yes, the subtitle is Be a Good Human and a Badass Leader. But how do you explain the success of all these strong, white, male, alpha males out there? So that doesn't make sense to me. That's the question.
Okay.
And I don't have a good answer.
What do you think is the answer?
That's actually what I'm working on right now, like in my little thought leadership practice. I think that what's going on right now is that we're looking at a short period of time. I still put forward that if we look in the long run, that judging 5-10 years out, we might look back and say they weren't actually as successful as we might at times thought they were. So that's number 1. I do believe that as humans, we have fallen into, and I'm now talking about the sort of the recipients, the followers, the citizens of the world. We've fallen into this trap of looking for very simple black and white answers. Social media doesn't help, no question about that. And because the world is so overwhelming, we want to, we still have the brain from many thousand years ago. We want the black and white simple answers. And some of these strong men provide exactly that autocratic leadership approach. So those 2 things.
Yeah. Time will tell.
Yeah, there's more. Right, exactly.
Yeah, time will tell with that. Well, Urs, thank you very much. The Bear King, Urs Koenig.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
The Bear King. That's what we'll call this podcast episode. The Bear King has spoken.
That Bear King has spoken. I love it.
That'll catch a lot of clicks right there. But I guess if people need to find you, what are you up to and how do they find you?
Sure. On the web at urskoenig.com for my speaking and workshops. And then LinkedIn is where I'm most active. So I'd love to hear from people on LinkedIn, engage with my content.
Okay, Urs.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you.
That's a wrap on this episode of the Coachful Coaching Leadership Podcast. I'm David Fung, and my mission is to help leaders grow, lead with impact, and build thriving teams. If you found this valuable, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a fellow leader. Until next time, keep leading with purpose.